class I've seen in years. They're all silent at precisely the assigned time here. You can come train my biology class. I'm Tom Pollard. I'm Dean of the Graduate School. And this is part of our Company of Scholars lecture series this year. Our speaker today is Beverly Gage, who's a specialist on 20th century political history. Beverly is a Yale College graduate, 1994, with a bachelor's degree in American history and a Phi Beta Kappa. She must have been a really, really good student. In 2004, she received her PhD from Columbia University in history again, and with distinction. In 2004, she joined the Yale faculty in the history department and has risen through the ranks and was promoted full professor of tenure in 2012. That's how I got to know Beverly. A lot of other young faculty members, because I serve on the promotions committee, and I was really excited about the work she was doing, specifically the work she's going to talk about here today. Beverly has a teaching prize here at Yale and has distinguished herself as well by having a public presence, because she appears regularly in the public media, on the PBS NewsHour. She's considered consultant with the New York Times, and so she really helps our outreach to the general public in her areas of interest. She's published one book already on an event that I didn't even know occurred, but was interested to learn about. In 1920, there was a terrorist attack on Wall Street. She wrote a whole book about that as the first example of terrorism in the United States. She has another book that she's working on. It's going to be available in a couple of years, apparently, with a little bit of luck, on J. Edgar Hoover, and that's the topic of our lecture here this afternoon. And I'm particularly interested in this topic because when I was growing up in the 1940s and 50s, J. Edgar Hoover was some kind of a mysterious, scary, mythical figure in our society who I really didn't understand. I didn't understand why he had so much power, why some people were so enamored of him, and why other people were afraid of him. And Beverly is going to help explain that to us here today. Thank you, Beverly.
All right, well, thanks to Dean Pollard and to the graduate school and to all of you for coming out on this cold, cold day. I am, in fact, going to be talking about J. Edgar Hoover and about this book that I'm writing right now about J. Edgar Hoover. And that actually was a sort of perfect introduction in ways that I don't think that Dean Pollard even quite understands, because the two themes, in fact, of this lecture are, how did J. Edgar Hoover get to be so powerful, and who the heck actually liked J. Edgar Hoover during his lifetime? So I'm going to actually start out with a little bit up here on PowerPoint. For most of the talk, I'm just going to be here talking. I'm going to talk for maybe 30, 40 minutes and hopefully leave quite a lot of time for Q&A. But to start out, I have exactly 2 slides and really 3 images that I wanted to present. So when most people hear the name J. Edgar Hoover these days, one of 2 of these kinds of images come to mind. So over here we have J. Edgar Hoover, and if you can see him, so he's holding a gun, although Hoover himself was never much of a shot, though you had lots of pictures of him holding a Tommy gun. He was never much of a shooter himself, but he's also holding a torn Constitution in his hand, and down around him you have all of the people whose lives he destroyed in the process of tearing apart the Constitution. Socialists, union leaders, black leaders, Native Americans, third parties. And I think this is one of our 2 dominant images of J. Edgar Hoover at the moment. J. Edgar Hoover, shredder of civil liberties, particularly destroyer of the American left. And much of what's been written about Hoover has been in sort of the vein of understanding civil liberties and their violation in the 20th century. The second dominant image at the moment, this is, of course, when you tell people you're working on J. Edgar Hoover, this is the first question you get, is the question about the dress and about Hoover's sexuality. So this is actually a cartoon. These are a bunch of FBI agents over here. This is a cartoon that came out in the 1990s, and they're saying, you know, oh, if only J. Edgar, this is at a time when there were scandals about the FBI lab and its inefficiencies. And they are saying, if only J. Edgar Hoover were alive, we wouldn't be having this kind of image problem. And then here's Hoover wearing lady stockings and high heels coming dancing around the corner. And then they said, oh, wait a minute, I take it back. And this image of Hoover as both a kind of repressed gay man, potentially a cross-dresser, certainly was the dominant image of the movie that came out last year, the movie J. Edgar, starring a creepily aging Leonardo DiCaprio. And that movie really focused on Hoover's relationship with his second-in-command, the associate director at the FBI, Clyde Tolson. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and there's lots more to say about that in the Q&A. But to start out here, I actually wanted to present a third image, which is an image, I think, that contains its own set of surprises at this point in the context of what we know about Hoover. And I'm actually going to, at least attempt here, to show a 1-minute long video. And I might even ask you for your responses when this video is over. So I want to set up a little bit of what we're seeing here. So you probably recognize this fellow, Richard Nixon, who has his own complicated past and complicated history as well, which we can talk about. But this is Richard Nixon at the very end of his first term at J. Edgar Hoover's funeral on May 4th, 1972. So a couple of important bits of context before you watch the video itself. At the moment that Hoover died, he was still the director of the FBI, and at that point he had been the director of the FBI for 48 years. He became director of the Bureau in 1924 when he was 29 years old, and he died in 1972 at the age of 77 in the same job. His extended career at the Justice Department was actually even longer than that. He entered the Justice Department in 1917, began really working intensively with the Bureau in 1919, and as I said, at the age of 29, became its director. So had this 55-year career at the Bureau, or at the Justice Department, of which 48 were as director of the FBI. So that's one piece of context. Second piece of context is this man up here, Richard Nixon. And Hoover and Nixon had a very interesting and long-standing relationship. They met working together on the Alger Hiss case when Nixon was a new congressman in the late 1940s, and really provided each other with a lot of political support and with, I think, a genuine friendship, at least of sorts, throughout the 1950s and 60s, though they came somewhat to blows once Nixon was president. Nixon had actually said at certain points that he thought he might try to fire J. Edgar Hoover, and then he backed down and basically chickened out and failed to do so. But so there's a long history between Hoover and Nixon at this point. The last piece of context, to just give you a sense of this kind of mystery, fear to some degree, but also reverence that surrounded J. Edgar Hoover at the moment that he died in May of 1972. At this funeral, the previous day, Hoover had actually lain in state in the Capitol Rotunda. He's one of the only civil servants, aside from your military leaders and presidents. He's the only civil servant ever to have been given that honor. And when Nixon goes to give Hoover's eulogy at his funeral at the National Presbyterian Church, television stops. All three networks actually broadcast J. Edgar Hoover's funeral live. And so what we're going to do is just watch a small clip of Nixon here giving J. Edgar Hoover's eulogy in May of 1972. And then I'll talk about why I think that's important.
The good J. Edgar Hoover has done will not die. The profound principles associated with his name will not fade away. Rather, I would predict that in the time ahead, those principles of respect for law, order, and justice will come to govern our national life more completely than ever before. Because the trend of permissiveness in this country, a trend which Edgar Hoover fought against all his life, a trend which was dangerously eroding our national heritage as a law-abiding people, is now being reversed. The American people today are tired of disorder, disruption, and disrespect for law. America wants to come back to the law as a way of life.
All right. So there we are. So I'm curious if anyone has an immediate reaction to that clip that they want to share, either people who remember J. Edgar Hoover from their own earlier years, or I have my own thoughts about why that's important, but does anyone have other thoughts? Yeah.
It's just funny to think of 1972 that then Americans had come back to law as a way of life. It seems like a funny moment to make that claim. And you have to imagine that the audience had something in mind that he would have thought would have agreed with that, but it doesn't seem like a particular moment of anti-violence in American history. So it's interesting to think what he was inferring about the order that the structures of bureaucracy brought about.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, I think it's just ironic that Watergate was about to break open.
Right, this is absolutely true. So May 1972, Hoover dies. June of 1972 is the Watergate break-in. And actually, I'm not going to talk about this a lot in my talk, though maybe we can get to it in the Q&A. I think there's actually a pretty good case to be made that Watergate would not have played out the way that it played out if J. Edgar Hoover were still alive. I actually wrote an article about this, so I can tell you about that if you're curious at the end. Any other reactions? Just, yeah.
It doesn't sound like a eulogy to me. It sounds like a speech maybe associated with a news item, for example.
Okay, yeah, so it doesn't sound like a eulogy. And of course, this is the middle of the 1972 campaign. So that may be part of the reason that it doesn't sound like a eulogy. But there's, I think, a little more to be said about that. Any other just immediate reactions?
Well, the other is the rebellion against the Vietnam War, which is in the background of all of that.
Right, right. So this is coming at a moment when certainly kind of anti-war protest has been building and building for many years. Nixon has become mired in this, and Hoover has, you've seen the first exposures of the FBI's campaigns against the anti-war movement as well. So maybe we'll take these two last ones, yeah.
For those of us who were working here at Yale in that period, Nixon had been absolutely intent on pushing dissent down underneath, and I know that Hoover helped him in that part. So you have it's an irony that he stands up there saying how much we want it, when in fact what he was imposing as best he could.
Mm-hmm. Right, so the idea that they are actually claiming to stand for law and order while at the same time suppressing dissent. And we have one last one here.
Yeah, I mean, just based on the title of your talk and also just what I was hearing in that, that was what Nixon said there was very briefly the embodiment of the kind of law and order conservatism that was the reaction to the perceived disorder from the sort of late 60s to early 70s, civil rights movements, assassinations, protests against the Vietnam War, sexual, permissiveness and so forth, crime, that really led to this conservative movement that was, I think at least initially based on this idea that we are not going to be a society that is in decay and defining deviancy down and all that kind of thing.
Great. So we also have the theme of kind of the birth, or I would say the extension of what was referred to then and now as in, you want to turn that on, as law and order conservatism. So I think we've actually already hit upon many of the, let's see what happens if I close that. Will that just go to sleep? All right, well, I'm going to leave that up there because I'm not showing a lot more slides for the moment. There's nothing too distracting there, right? Okay. So I also wanted to show that clip, and I'll just throw out my three reasons that I think it's striking to look at. So one is the fact that J. Edgar Hoover in that moment had a funeral like that, right? Had a funeral that stopped all three networks, and that he had that kind of power and influence not only within Washington, but as a kind of cultural and political icon. The second thing that I think is particularly compelling to me, which is what a lot of people seem to have seized on here, and maybe the title of my talk was a little bit suggestive in this sense, is in fact the fact that J. Edgar Hoover stood for something, and stood for something that people recognized, stood for a particular kind of politics, stood for a particular kind of political language, and stood, I think, for a certain kind of complicated political hypocrisy, as Henry was suggesting, but I think it's more complicated than simply saying Hoover claimed to be defending the law at the same time that he was breaking it. The third thing that is particularly striking to me about that clip is, in fact, just how much J. Edgar Hoover's image has changed since that moment. As I said, we have now these kind of two dominant icons of him. One of him as this kind of unadulterated villain of civil liberties, one as this kind of laughingstock, the butt of jokes, or at the very least this story of him as a kind of repressed and sad man who was playing out his kind of psychosexual situation on the national stage. And I guess what I'm trying to do in this book that I'm writing is to take Hoover again away from these kind of marginal images of him, these images in which he's this kind of rogue figure, in which he's this one-dimensional villain, in which he's the butt of jokes, and bring him back into the place that he occupied, for better or worse, in 1972 and for much of his career, which is at the center, or maybe the center-right, of American politics. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today. The question that in many ways is going to drive my talk today, and I think drives my own kind of intellectual relationship with this project, is the question of how it is that a man who was outspoken and ideologically conservative maintained the level of power and influence that he did in the period that we generally think of as the great age of American liberalism, right? As we narrate our politics in general, the period from the 1930s through the 1970s was exactly the period that Hoover had his greatest power and influence. We often talk about as the great age of American liberalism, particularly at the federal level. So how do we put these pieces together? How do we want to think about Hoover as simultaneously an ideological conservative and someone who exercised an enormous amount of state government power during this great liberal age? So that's really the driving question, as I said, both of my book in terms of American politics and in terms of my talk today. Before I get into sorting out some of the pieces of that, I just thought I would say a little bit more about the book itself and about the kinds of challenges that come first with writing a biography and secondly with writing a biography of a man like J. Edgar Hoover. So I first encountered Hoover, as Tom suggested, when I was writing my first book, which was about a bombing on Wall Street in 1920. You are not the only person who had never heard of this event. In fact, the impulse behind my writing that book in the first place was that I had never heard of that event, and I came across a little mention of it. This was when I was in graduate school, and I thought, wow, how strange. People were bombing Wall Street in 1920 and having fairly high numbers of casualty, which seemed like an interesting way into telling a story about ideas about capitalism, about Wall Street, about resistance to capitalism in Wall Street, and also about terrorism as a form of political violence that it turns out has a very, very long history in the United States. But in the course of writing that book, I came across this young man who was there at the then very tiny Bureau of Investigation within the Justice Department, only had a few hundred agents, who was back there both beginning to keep files on political radicals and also was largely running the investigation into this bombing. His initials are everywhere on those documents, and he was really the behind-the-scenes guy, though he was not then the head of the Bureau running that investigation, and his name was J. Edgar Hoover. What this meant, I think, for me was two things. So first, I was surprised to see Hoover there playing such an important role and expressing at that point in 1919 and 1920, so he's about 24 years old at this point, expressing so many of the ideas that are going to follow him throughout his career, particularly ideas about anti-communism, about the need for law and order in the United States, about the threat of subversion within the country. He's really there, just had the Bolshevik Revolution, and he's there very, very early on, articulating these things, thinking about these things, and really rising through the federal government as one of the architects of the way in which the American state thought about these things. And it was very striking to me how early that started. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's so striking. The other thing that happened in the course of doing that research was that I was forced to read a lot of literature about J. Edgar Hoover. And in the course of doing that, I realized a few things. The first was that a lot of it is not really very good. That Hoover is one of these figures who tends to attract a lot of incredibly obsessive kind of conspiracy theory approaches. So there's a lot of literature, actually, which I now have to plow through because some of it actually has some useful material there, but a lot of what had been written about him had been written by journalists, had been written by amateur historians, so he was someone who sort of occupied a lot of interest, but there wasn't a very well-developed literature about him at that point, to the degree that sort of serious scholars, serious historians, serious journalists had taken Hoover on. A lot of that tended to fall into one of two camps, that literature. During his lifetime, much of it was incredibly adulatory, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which Hoover was very good at cultivating journalists, giving them material so that they would, in fact, write books in particular that would reflect his own worldview. And after his death, almost all of it has been kind of counter-mythical. You thought J. Edgar Hoover was one thing, actually it turns out he's this other thing. And if you look at almost all the biographies of Hoover, they contain the words "The Secrets of J. Edgar Hoover," "Official and Confidential," but they're really about kind of taking down the myth of J. Edgar Hoover as it sort of occupied the American political sphere for many years. The third thing that I noticed about the literature on Hoover is that a lot of the best stuff had been written in the 1980s and 1990s. And there's a very brief period from about 1987 to 1993 when all four of the major biographies that exist of J. Edgar Hoover were written in very quick succession. All four of them are actually quite good and have sort of different takes on Hoover, bring different material and different themes to the fore, but they were all written in a particular moment. There was sort of a generational moment in which Hoover had died in the 70s. You began to get access to the files in the late 70s and early 80s, and then boom, you got this rush of books that attempted to define Hoover, and for the most part were written in this kind of vein of expose. The fact that it had been about 20 years since a biography of Hoover meant a few things. So the first thing that it meant was that in terms of materials, 20 years is a lifetime for the kinds of materials that you tend to deal with when you're writing about someone like J. Edgar Hoover. Right? He is not the kind of figure where you get to find out where his papers are, right? This is how historians work. You find out where his papers are kept, and then you go to that library and you sit down and they're all there and they're kind of arranged in folders for you, and you make your way through this body of files. In order to write about the FBI, most of this work has come through the Freedom of Information Act, and so some of that stuff is now public and is now publicly accessible in an easy way. Other researchers have also made their files public, but it's a pretty slow process, it's a pretty laborious process, and so it means that as time goes on, we begin to get more and more and more and more of this available as more and more researchers begin to think about doing this. So over the course of 20 years, there's just a whole world of new material that had come out. Just to give you one particularly dramatic example, at the time that the last set of biographies of Hoover were written, the Soviet Union was more or less still intact. As I said, the last really major biography came out in 1993. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, we've had access not only to Soviet archives, which have told us a great deal about communism and anti-communism, particularly espionage in the United States, but we have also found that the Soviet Union had the records of the American Communist Party, which have been missing for many years. The early records of the American Communist Party, we now have access to that, and we have access to things like the Venona documents, which was a secret espionage project that the FBI, in conjunction with the NSA, had conducted in the 1940s and had kept secret for many years, in which they were decrypting Soviet diplomatic cables, and this has shed all sorts of new and interesting light on some of the most famous espionage cases of that period, including the Alger Hiss case that I mentioned. So that was the first thing that it meant, that there was this whole wealth of new material that was out there. Another quick example, just since we already mentioned Watergate, is the fact that we now know that Mark Felt, who was Hoover's third in command at the FBI, was Deep Throat in Watergate. And so this gives us a whole new lens into how we want to think about the FBI's relationship to Watergate, its role in Watergate, and Mark Felt was there and sort of took over the Bureau, at least in an operational sense, at the moment that Hoover died. So there's a whole wealth of new information about particular cases in its totality that certainly come out over the course of the last 20, 25 years. So that seemed appealing as well. But the main thing that appealed to me about writing a new biography of J. Edgar Hoover really was interpretive and wanting to take advantage of new strains in scholarship that had come out over those 20 years as well, and really to take Hoover, as I said, from the margins, from being this figure of scandal, being seen as a rogue and a villain, and really think about what role he played in shaping the American state, in shaping American politics in a much more serious way, and I think in a way that is really suitable, whether you like him or you don't like him. And I think at this point, most people, myself included, don't particularly like him, though I've gotten to know him quite well. Whether you like him or not, it seems like a moment in which he needs to be taken seriously and thought about in this broader way. I will say, as I mentioned, that I'm not going to go into great detail about this, though I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A about these questions about his sexuality and his kind of identity in that vein. I will say that that is one area of scholarship that seemed like it was really ripe to kind of put the pieces together, to think about Hoover seriously in ways that would be informed by everything that's happened in queer studies, gay and lesbian studies, as well as in terms of gender studies, thinking about Hoover around the question of masculinity. This whole world of scholarship that's really developed over the last 20 or 30 years is incredibly useful for me in trying to make sense of Hoover in that vein. But today I'm going to stick to slightly more formal politics. I won't say that that's not politics, because I think that it is in its own way. And I'm really going to talk about two bodies of scholarly literature that have been particularly useful to me, and the ways in which they've both informed my understanding of Hoover, and then I think the ways in which Hoover also tells us something new and interesting about those bodies of scholarship. So I said that the driving question of my project, in some ways, is really, how did an ideological conservative maintain enormous state power, build and maintain enormous state power during this period that we usually conventionally describe as the heyday of American liberalism? I'm going to shorten that slightly now and just ask, how did J. Edgar Hoover maintain power for 48 years? He was an unelected bureaucrat, right? So he had to be reappointed first in his early years, when it was not a terribly powerful position, by the Attorney General, and then by successive presidents. He was there under 8 different presidents, half of them Republicans, half of them Democrats. It's an incredibly long career with an incredible amount of power. So how did this happen? And I think that the conventional answer, and in many ways the kind of answer that we've gotten out of this expose tradition, is that people were really scared of him. And I think in many ways for very good reason. As I said, a lot of what we've learned about Hoover over the last 30 or 40 years, and to some degree knew during his lifetime, though not with the detail that we know today, a lot of what we've learned are the ways in which he used the FBI to get people to do what he wanted, collecting sexual gossip on people in Washington, collecting details of people's lives, running disruption operations against social movements, as well as against, to some degree, as I said, political figures in Washington as well. So there's certainly a lot of truth to the idea that Hoover maintained his power through fear. And again, to refer back to the film, J. Edgar, which many of you probably saw, came out a year ago, and I think is a good kind of snapshot of where thinking is at that point. That really was one of the big themes of the film. You know, a lot of the film was Leonardo DiCaprio sort of in a darkened room listening to the tapes of Martin Luther King and, you know, kind of obsessing about Martin Luther King. So, at any rate, there's a lot of truth to this story, and people have done magnificent research in kind of ferreting out a lot more of the truth than we once knew about J. Edgar Hoover. But there are also a few problems with this immediate assumption that Hoover held his power only through fear and only because he had the goods on powerful people. The first is that it doesn't really explain to us how it is that he became the man that he became. When we think about Hoover having the goods on people conducting those kinds of operations, we're really talking about 40s and the 50s, really into the 1960s. So how did he, in fact, become the man that he became? How did he acquire this power in the first place in the first half of his career? And I think the second problem with this immediate reversion to fear as our only explanation for Hoover's career and for his power is that it doesn't explain at least a little bit of what we saw in that funeral image of Richard Nixon standing up there. It doesn't explain Hoover's power as a public figure, this kind of mystical figure, a household name, and a kind of universally known, if never ever universally loved figure. And so I think to answer those questions, we really have to think of Hoover, again, not as a rogue figure, not as someone who's operating in secrecy, but as someone whose entire career is deeply embedded within the history of the administrative state and the growth of government in the United States. In some ways, this seems like, okay, well, that's a little bit less interesting than his secret files, but I think it's really critical to understanding Hoover and how he operated. And in fact, I've come to conclude, though my editor is totally unpersuaded by this when I say, all of the drama is in the bureaucracy, right? It's all in how the bureaucratic rules were made. And she says, that is actually not where the drama is. That might be what you think, but nobody else is actually going to think that. So I am here to make the case that if this is not where all the drama is, it is really critical to understanding kind of how Hoover evolves as an architect and, in fact, in some ways, a recipient of a certain kind of tradition of state power. As I said, so that's really the first body of scholarly literature that I think Hoover's story needs to be situated in, this enormous profusion of scholarship that's happened really since the 1980s around the growth of the administrative state. Kind of how did, in a democracy, how did we get an enormous federal government, most of which is entirely unelected and in many cases relatively unaccountable to electoral power. And within that literature, the stuff that's particularly useful to me is the literature around the idea of bureaucratic autonomy, which is the question of how is it that unelected bureaucrats, people like Hoover, agency chiefs, manage to insulate themselves from an electoral political system, a political system that revolves around parties and other kinds of power. How do they, in fact, achieve independent power and independent political bases? And in Hoover's case, how do you end up with a 48-year career? So that's sort of the literature in which I think we need to think about the evolution of Hoover's power. And in some ways, he is kind of born to this government tradition. He is an exact contemporary of figures like Robert Moses, right? Another kind of who was the Parks Commissioner of New York, right? Another man who's sort of born at the right time in the right place to take advantage of a kind of explosion of government power. But Hoover himself is actually born in 1895 in Washington, D.C. He is born 5 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, and he never lives anywhere else. So in this sense, he really is this pure product of Washington politics, and he happens to be in the right place at the right time as the government begins to grow, and particularly as the security state begins to grow. His first job in the government is in 1917 as the U.S. is having this enormous expansion expansion of government capacities in World War I. And so they're just hiring an entire generation of new young people to come in and to really administer, in that case, the war effort on a scale that has not been seen before. And in many ways, Hoover, for the first 20 years of his career, is deeply embedded in what many people would describe as the expansion of the liberal or the progressive state. So putting aside everything we know about who he later becomes, and to some degree putting aside the role that he plays in the first Red Scare of 1919 and 1920, which I can talk about, Hoover really comes to his appointment as bureau director and then lasts through the 1920s and the 1930s on his reputation for being an efficient bureaucrat, for being a professional, for being divorced from politics, many of the same themes and ideas that led to the creation of other kinds of state agencies and state bureaucracies. So my argument, I guess, is that we need to think about Hoover again, not just as a figure who held power because he had the goods on people, but as someone who in many ways was quite typical of the ways in which state power was built, whether you're talking about a social welfare agency, whether you're talking to some degree about the military, though I think the military is an exception, but any of the state agencies you see emerging in Washington in the 20s, but then really in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, I think we need to understand Hoover in that vein. The second thing that I will say about the literature on bureaucratic autonomy that I found particularly useful is that Hoover is a figure who is not only very good at getting the goods on people, but he's a figure who knows how to use certain kinds of techniques of bureaucracy internally and externally, in fact, to give himself an independent political base. So he runs an enormous propaganda operation throughout much of his career in which he understands that if he wants to maintain his position, if he wants to maintain his agency's reputation, he has to appeal directly to a mass public on a variety of themes, some of which are about professionalism, some of which are about law and order, some of which are kind of about detective mysteries and the swashbuckling G-men, and some of which are overtly conservative. But so he's very effective at running that kind of propaganda operation. I think, as interestingly, he's also very effective at building his own political alliances with grassroots organizations. We don't tend to think of J. Edgar Hoover in that vein, but particularly kind of club-oriented conservative organizations like the Daughters of the American Revolution, the American Legion, etc. They had very tight relationships with the FBI, and they're sort of back and forth relationships. Hoover legitimated a lot of their interests, often helped these organizations out, and when he was in trouble, they often came to put pressure on congressmen and to write letters to newspapers in defense of J. Edgar Hoover. So I think we have to think about him as a political organizer as well. My last thing that I will say about J. Edgar Hoover as a bureaucrat is that I have become convinced that the single most important thing that he did in his entire career in order to maintain power was not, in fact, knowing about John F. Kennedy's affairs or following Eleanor Roosevelt and going to Franklin and reporting about who she, in fact, was seeing. The single most important thing he did to maintain power was to keep his agents out of the civil service system. He fought his entire career to keep his agents out of civil service, and what this meant was that he was actually able to build an agency in which he himself had almost sole control over the hiring, the firing of agents, the kind of person he wanted. He justified this not on the grounds of personal control, but on the grounds of saying that the FBI is so fabulous and its standards are so high that they simply cannot take the sort of mass of people who are being recommended out of the civil service. But again, these kinds of bureaucratic questions, these kinds of state building questions, I think are as important for understanding J. Edgar Hoover as what files he might have maintained. So that's sort of the first piece. I said, so the driving force, at least in part, of this biography is how does an ideological conservative maintain state power throughout the age of American liberalism? And so we've got a little bit of the power story there. I want to quickly talk about the literature on conservatism and just suggest a few ways in which I think Hoover tells us some new and interesting things there. So again, over the past 20 or so years, young historians in particular have discovered that there's a whole history to American conservatism. Right before I started graduate school, my graduate advisor, who was a professor at Columbia named Alan Brinkley, wrote an essay for our professional journal that basically started out saying, why doesn't anyone study the history of American conservatism? So this was 1994. You'd gotten through the Reagan years, but you just had, Newt Gingrich's revolution of 1994. Conservatism is out there. You sort of put out this call, and over the past 15, 20 years, there's been an explosion of interest in kind of writing about conservatism, telling this story. Without going into a lot of detail about this, the basic story that has emerged is a story that tends to begin in the 1950s, to revolve both around social movements, organizations like the John Birch Society, and kind of elite figures like William F. Buckley, who gets his start right here, in the 40s and 50s, and tends to sort of tell a story of this surge of conservative interest, of a self-defined conservative movement kind of coming of age in its first moment with the Barry Goldwater campaign in 1964, and then kind of achieving national power in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. This is a story where the pieces hadn't been put together before, and we've got a lot of great literature out there about different kinds of social movements that play a role in that, about the role of business, about the role of intellectuals, all sorts of things. But I think that J. Edgar Hoover actually poses some new questions for us as we begin to think about this literature on conservatism. So the first thing is that, as I said, Hoover is articulating the same ideas in 1919 that he is articulating in 1972. Now, this may just say something about J. Edgar Hoover as a person who was, in fact, very rigid, very resistant to change, but I think it actually tells us something more interesting and raises really interesting questions about how we want to think about the role that conservatism has played in modern American politics. So Hoover in 1972 is looking back to 1919 and saying, we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing these kinds of bombings. We're seeing disorder. The same things that Richard Nixon is saying in that little clip that I showed. J. Edgar Hoover is already beginning to use that language in the teens, in the 20s, and in the 30s. So I think his story suggests that we want to kind of break apart this story that modern conservatism comes out of the reaction to the New Deal and out of the 1950s. The second thing that I think Hoover is useful for thinking about is that, as I said, a lot of the ways in which we tend to think about conservative politics is either in an electoral frame or in a kind of social movement frame, right? So you've got the grassroots story, this kind of resurgence that begins in the 50s into the 60s and 70s, or you have a kind of electoral politics story. Well, Hoover is a very interesting figure in this regard. As I said, he's actually someone who is not sort of operating outside the centers of Washington power. He is deeply embedded in them throughout this whole period. And I think it's interesting to consider, and I'll be happy to expand upon this in the Q&A a little bit, interesting to consider Hoover as a kind of conservative state builder. So in what ways do his conservative politics shape what he does within his agency? And in what ways do his conservative politics sort of shape the kind of message that he is sending out into the world? The third piece that I'll mention quickly is that I think it's very important to think about the FBI within the context of this story of, I don't know, a kind of battle between the left and the right throughout these years, or between liberalism and conservatism, because the fact of J. Edgar Hoover and the kinds of politics that he had actually meant that people on the ground, activists on the ground, had very, very different relationships to state power. It is a fundamentally different experience to be organizing on the left, and we all probably basically know the story of the FBI's relationship with the New Left, with the Black Panthers, with the anti-war movement, right? It's a fundamentally different experience to fear that your organization is being infiltrated, to know that the federal government is watching you and is against you, than it is to be organizing even in a similar grassroots organization on the right, and know that in some sense the FBI is behind you, that J. Edgar Hoover is basically tolerant or supportive of your politics. Now, I don't think this explains everything, certainly about what's going on in social movements, but to the degree that we are talking in the 1960s now about a kind of battle that's emerged between the left and the right during those years, I think it's important to see that their relationships with the state and with the FBI in particular are not equivalent, and that they're very different on-the-ground experiences, in part because of this man who is there at the top in the FBI. All right, just to finish up, I want to say a few things going back to our Nixon at J. Edgar Hoover's funeral. I said, the things that stood out to me about that clip were, number one, the fact of the funeral, right? The fact that this unelected bureaucrat was able to kind of bring together the kind of power and interest and cultural influence that Hoover did in 1972 and in the years leading up to that. The second was that he stood for something, right? He stood for a particular kind of conservative politics and really was a bulwark of that kind of conservative politics throughout this period we describe as the age of American liberalism. The third piece that I just want to say, that I mentioned at the beginning and want to expand upon very briefly, is just how much Hoover's image has changed since that moment. Now, certainly there were lots of people who hated J. Edgar Hoover throughout his life, but I think there's something to be explained in just how dramatically his image has changed over the last 40 years. And probably the best embodiment of this for me is that in 1975, this is 3 years after he died, the FBI finally got its own building on Pennsylvania Avenue. It had been within the Justice Department's building previous to that. And when the FBI got its own building, it was labeled the J. Edgar Hoover Building. It was put up as this kind of great monument to the great man who had built the Bureau. Today, they are actually probably going to knock down that building because it's kind of a monstrosity, like mid-70s terrible architecture. It looks kind of like the old New Haven Coliseum. So you can see. So they are probably going to move out of this building. And there is an almost universal assumption that when they move out of that building and when they knock that building down, the next FBI building is not going to be called the J. Edgar Hoover Building. And in fact, there have been battles over the last 15 to 20 years to actually have his name stripped off of the FBI building that is still standing there. So I think on the one hand, this is the product of what I was saying earlier, right? We do know more about him, right? We've had these exposés. We know more about the lawlessness and the corruption and the real venality that the FBI was engaged in over that time. But I think it's important to historicize our own thoughts as well. So I'll just leave you with a couple of reasons why I think J. Edgar Hoover's image has changed so much, going beyond the fact that we just know some more of the really problematic things that were going on. The first is that Hoover happened to die at a moment of expose, right? He happened to die as Watergate is beginning to take off, and this really comes to fruition with things like the Church Committee and with other exposés of the CIA, of other intelligence agencies, and new constraints on intelligence agencies. And in that context, I do think, probably deservedly so, Hoover emerged as something of a scapegoat, as a person upon whom you could say, oh, look at all of those terrible, terrible things that happened. Well, there's the man who did them, and now he's dead, and he was a very, very bad man, and none of the rest of us actually have to take this too seriously or think about taking responsibility for it ourselves. So I think it has both served, truth, but has also had the effect of kind of absolving other people of a certain kind of responsibility and limiting the degree to which we're going to think in broader terms. It was just that one bad apple, that very powerful apple, that bad apple. I think the second thing that's worth thinking about is why people have become increasingly interested in Hoover's sex life. And it's inherently pretty interesting on the one hand. On the other hand, it is actually, I think, also a product of a pretty profound shift that's happened in how we think about our public officials. And I think, to some degree, for the better, and to some degree, for the worse, in the sense that, not only did we not know a lot about J. Edgar Hoover's sex life at the time, but we didn't know a lot about what a whole lot of other powerful people were doing in their intimate relationships. And so on the one hand, it has this kind of scandalous and interesting quality to it. On the other hand, I think we do have to think about Hoover in relationship to a broader culture, which has begun to take seriously, I think for good reasons and for bad, the personal lives of its public figures and how we want to put those pieces together. So I see that I've run a little bit over my prescribed time, which was 40 minutes. So I think I will actually just leave it there for now. But the last thing that I want to say is that overall, one of the challenges of writing about Hoover is that I am trying to write a biography that takes him seriously and really looks at his power and his influence, takes his personal life, his childhood seriously, at the same time without writing a redemptive biography of a man who I think in many ways had a very, very destructive influence on the United States and on the shape of its political culture and on the shape of American government. So I will leave it there for now. Hopefully we can do some questions.
Beverly would be happy to answer some questions, so please, and why don't you repeat the questions for the YouTube people?
You and I were at a panel recently in which a person called J. Edgar Hoover one of the great American patriots. A patriot can be a conservative, and a patriot can be a liberal. I've always suspected that he had no political belief, but that he espoused to be a dictator, not necessarily a national dictator, but a dictator in his own world. And dictators always suggest that people are coming in from the outside, undermining the state. And whether you're talking about Hitler or today, President Assad, it's always the outsiders coming in. And that's what helps to build up a kind of dictatorship. So did he really have political beliefs, or was he merely a narcissistic power grabber?
Well, yes and yes. So the question is, was J. Edgar Hoover a narcissistic power grabber, or did he have genuine political beliefs? And I think the challenge of writing about him is that these things are simultaneously true. The question was sort of centered around the idea that dictators tend to describe, kind of hold and maintain power by describing subversive forces that are about to invade and then defending the population from these subversive forces, internal or external. So is Hoover any more complicated than that? And I think that he actually is. I think that the consistency of his outlook over time, and particularly the role that he ends up playing, especially around the question of communism, but not exclusively around the question of communism, in articulating it not only as a kind of national security threat, but going significantly beyond that to talk about and write about and publish bestsellers about godless communism, the threat of atheistic communism. I mean, Hoover wrote about the traditional family. He wrote about religion. He was active in the Boy Scouts and in kind of, manly politics, bringing up our men to be good citizens, this sort of stuff. So actually, his worldview is, on the one hand, very consistent over time, and on the other hand, I think slightly broader than we generally understand it to be. So he really does have this kind of cultural force. And it is absolutely true that throughout his career, the question of power and who's going to be in control of the situation and who's going to be in control of his bureaucracy are almost always the dominant issues. But there are moments in which he actually also makes decisions that put the FBI at a certain amount of risk for what he understands to be ideological reasons, particularly around the question of communism.
You alluded to some of the reasons why there might be this interest these days in his sexuality. Do you think that some of that has to do with, in this age of now gay rights and so forth, conflict over that, the impulse that we see today on the modern left to kind of out and to criticize conservative figures who defend traditional values and attack sexually deviant, individuals while themselves being sexually deviant in one way or another. And I can name any number of congressmen and senators.
Right, yes. So the question is, to what degree is the interest in Hoover's sexuality about an impulse to expose hypocrisy, essentially? I mean, particularly within the gay rights movement, to out people who are in power, particularly people who spend a lot of time either citing family values or, in fact, persecuting people for their sexual deviancy at the same time. How did you put it? You had a very nice way of putting it. At the same time that they themselves are engaged in all sorts of sexual deviancy of one sort or another. I absolutely think that this is Hoover's type, right? And one of the things that is really interesting that I'm trying to sort out, and I would love to hear people in this room, is that there does seem to be, I mean, certainly this is something that we see playing out in our own politics today, but particularly in the 1950s, it seems that there is this strange meshing of kind of anti-communism and anti-homosexuality. And it's very well established that at the same time that a Red Scare is going on in the 1940s and 1950s, there's what we're now calling the Lavender Scare, in which actually more homosexuals than communists are being purged from government jobs, are being seen as national security risks, particularly within the State Department, but within a whole variety of government agencies at that point. And at the same time, many of the figures who are most deeply engaged in this are themselves being accused of being homosexual, and in some cases, we know very well a figure like Roy Cohn, in fact, who was worked on the McCarthy Committee, sort of infamous figure of that time. If you've ever seen Angels in America, right, we have Roy Cohn there, exactly fitting this type. And there are a number of men in Hoover's circle in the 40s and 50s who do seem to fit into that framework. So, the question is, how do we put all of those pieces together, right? Are they actively defending themselves and their own positions and kind of going to extremes in order to defend themselves from these accusations, right? That seems to be part of it. How exactly the questions of communism and homosexuality fit in a piece for these men, I think, is a very interesting question. What kind of world are they themselves living in? And we have little snippets of information. I mean, one of the things that's actually particularly interesting about Hoover's relationship with Clyde Tolson is that in some sense it was extremely public, right? We have this idea that they were these closeted men, and on the one hand, they would have denied to the ends of the earth that they were homosexual. At least they would have denied that publicly. On the other hand, they spend 40 years together, traveling together, having dinner together every night, kind of going to each other's family funerals, being really a very functional and well-recognized social couple in Washington. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's going on in this moment, and I think there are two things. I mean, one, I'm not sure that just a story of hypocrisy really gets to the root of this. I think there are probably more interesting things to do with it. And I think that we also have to try to kind of historicize these questions, and things look very different in the 1930s than they look in the 1950s around those kinds of questions, and they look different again in the 1970s, though we can, as you noted, see these continuities of type over time.
Have you consciously avoided the language of psychology or psychiatry? I would have called him deeply paranoid.
Yes. So this is one of the great biographical questions, right? And the question of psychobiography and where to go. I mean, Hoover is a very, very interesting figure on this account. I mean, many people are. So first of all, there's a lot of real diagnosed mental illness in his family. His father actually dies of, it's a little hard to tell, but depression. He's institutionalized when Hoover is a teenager and dies of some combination of depression, maybe alcoholism, but his death certificate actually says that he dies of melancholia, which is depression, and the secondary cause of death is inanition, which means that he basically lost the will to live, stopped eating, and kind of just faded away and starved to death. So, I mean, so there is deep mental illness and real diagnosed mental illness in Hoover's family. And then more broadly, right, there are these questions about words like paranoia, which is a kind of psychological term, but not a diagnosis of sorts. And it's very clear that actually Hoover, as an older man, he's always a very, very rigid person, right? And he's very, as you can imagine, he likes the rules, right? And if you have a typo in your FBI report, you're going to get a letter back. And this is from the moment that he's a young man till the day he dies. You're going to get a 2-page letter back from J. Edgar Hoover saying, "You have betrayed me," right? This is unthinkable. This is unspeakable. How can we have this level of chaos and disorder within our own agency? I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot. And this level of rigidity really only increases as he becomes an older man. So putting together the question of kind of how personality meets political structure and political ideology, it's a challenge. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer to the question, but it's one that I clearly have to sort out. Yeah.
2 questions. Who was the man that the camera zoomed in on at the funeral? Was that Tolson?
I was trying to, I saw that. I think that was L. Patrick Gray, who had been appointed by Nixon to be Hoover's successor at the FBI. This is one of the things that becomes a source of disorder during Watergate, is that he appointed an outsider instead of an insider.
And then the second one, in terms of how Hoover stayed in power during the heyday of liberalism, isn't part of the answer that it was Cold War liberalism. So it was not the kind of liberalism that follows basically after his death in '72. So he was always on the right side. Whether the administration was Republican or Democratic, they were all on the same side of the Cold War.
I think that's true in part, although there are many moments where, someone like Harry Truman is not particularly enthused about J. Edgar Hoover, and Hoover actually, they really come to blows. Truman wants to fire Hoover. He feels like he cannot fire Hoover. And the reasons that he cannot fire Hoover are in part because, Hoover's a powerful man with files, but really often, and Kennedy says the same thing, because he's so popular. He's so popular, and they feel like it would just be such a political disaster for themselves to fire him. So I think that's absolutely right. And Hoover was actually very good at cultivating people like Franklin Roosevelt, who really, of any president, is the person who empowers Hoover. In the 20s and 30s, there are pretty serious restrictions on what the FBI can do, and it's during the Second World War, and a little bit earlier as well, that it's Franklin Roosevelt who comes and says, we've got to keep an eye on communists, we've got to keep an eye on fascists, and kind of gives Hoover this power. So, yeah.
It strikes me that the content of Hoover's conservatism, as you've described it, is not anti-radical in the sense of being anything about private property or free markets or anything like this, but really a profound Americanism, and the enemy being things he perceives to be anti-Americanism. But so it's interesting that he comes from Washington, D.C., because I think about that ideology as sort of like quintessentially American Midwest, right? And you think of Joe McCarthy as someone who, in a similar vein, it's about communism, but it's not really about communism, it's about America. And there's a sort of petty bourgeois element to his ideological project, and Nixon probably fits that bill too. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about Hoover's upbringing and who his parents are, and what is the milieu that he's coming up in that he is so, feels this strong need to protect a particular vision of American culture, which is what it sounds like is the thing he feels is under threat.
Right. Well, I think I'm supposed to not go on at great length at this point, but I'll say quickly 2 things. So one, I think it's very true, right? To the degree that sort of conventional wisdom would suggest that the main strains of kind of mid-century conservatism are anti-communism, a kind of traditional Protestant religious cultural strain, sometimes fundamentalist, sometimes somewhat short of that, and a kind of free enterprise libertarian strain, right? And these are all competing with each other. We might add the question of race in there and put that in as a 4th strain, or one that overlaps with all of these, right? The one that Hoover absolutely doesn't really occupy is the kind of libertarian strain, right? Is a free enterprise strain. He is an architect of the state, right? I mean, he's a big government guy in his own way. And so I think to the degree that that's become really a dominant strain on the American right now, I think it also helps to explain why the right really doesn't claim J. Edgar Hoover anymore. I mean, why nobody claims J. Edgar Hoover at this point outside of fairly limited circles. The question of his childhood is interesting. So his father is a government servant. I mean, everyone in his family are government servants of one sort or another, but very kind of mid-level government servants. His father works at the Coast Survey. He's a printer. And his father had worked at the Coast Survey. And they're an old Washington family from the early 19th century. And he grows up in a kind of, Presbyterian Protestant tradition. So I'm not sure that you can look so much to his childhood for these kinds of ideological concepts. I mean, I think he's really shaped by World War I and the Red Scare after it. And this is the moment in which his politics are established, and those politics really last. And so to that degree, this concept of Americanism, or 100% Americanism, that is so much a strain of that moment, I think lasts for him.
Well, terrific. I've got 2 thanks and 2 invitations. First, I want to thank Beverly for a fabulous talk, very stimulating. Obviously, the audience enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you all for coming and asking so many great questions. And my 2 invitations are, number 1, to come to our reception, which is next door in the common room, where you'll be able to ask Beverly some additional questions. And then to come back for our next 2 Company of Scholars lectures. The next one is about families and upbringing of families in the United States.
Katie's right there.
Katie right there. Katie, stand up. You're going to be next. Katie Lofton. And the last one seems to be divergent because it's by Paul Tipton on the Higgs boson, which is a big scientific discovery in the last year. But his theme is actually about whether the taxpayers of all the countries in the world got their money worth in discovering the Higgs boson. It has to do with politics as well. So thank you all for coming.
It's a what-if question.
Yeah.